You know, we often think of history as this slow, steady march. But sometimes it just breaks. In the 1930s, the whole world didn't just stumble, it completely fell apart. This wasn't just some recession. It was an economic bomb that went off. And the fallout, well, it cleared the way for the deadliest war we've ever seen. And it all kicked off with one single disastrous day. So let's talk about a really, really bad day. The date was October 29th, 1929. And on that one Tuesday, $26 billion just poof, vanished from the Wall Street stock market. I mean, can you even imagine? That single event triggered a financial tsunami that literally washed over the entire planet. And it would send two very, very different countries spinning down two paths that would change everything. Okay, so here's what we're going to break down. First, we'll look at how the world was basically built on debt. Then we'll dive into Germany and see how this crisis opened the door for Nazism. After that, we'll jump over to Australia, where this idea of a paradise got completely wrecked. And finally, we'll try to figure out how these two paths, starting from the same place, ended up so differently. So you gotta ask, why was the whole world so fragile? Well, the peace and, the good times of the 1920s, it was all basically a house of cards. And this was especially true for a place like Germany, which was already on its knees after World War I. The whole thing was being held up by one thing and one thing only: American cap. This is where something called the Dawes and Young plans come in. Think of them as a giant financial lifeline from the US to Germany. The idea was to help Germany pay off its massive war debts and rebuild. And hey, for a little while, it kind of worked. But there was a huge catch. It made Germany, and really all of Europe, totally hooked on that American money. It was like a financial addiction, and the supply was about to get cut off. And boom, here's how the first domino fell and knocked over all the others. The Wall Street crash happens. Right away, panicked American banks start calling in their loans from overseas. They wanted their money back, and they wanted it now. Suddenly, credit, which is like the oxygen for the global economy, just vanished. Gone. Countries panicked, threw up trade walls, and just like that, global trade completely collapsed. Everyone was dragged down with it. All right, let's zero in on Germany. For its young, shaky democracy, the Weimar Republic, this economic shock wasn't just a setback, it was a kill shot. You have to remember, this country was already deeply scarred. They'd lost a war, been humiliated on the world stage, and had their money become worthless just a few years before. So this new crisis, it was the perfect storm of chaos and rage. Just what a fringe political party needed to twist that suffering into power. And this is where it gets really personal for millions of people. In 1931, it stopped being about abstract numbers when Germany's second biggest bank, the Dynat Bank, just went under. I mean, imagine that. For the second time in 10 years, the savings of the entire middle class were just gone, wiped out. And you can bet the Nazis jumped all over this. They pointed and screamed, "See, the whole system is corrupt. It's destroying you." It was powerful, poisonous propaganda. And the result? By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. That's not just a percentage. That's a whole lot of people. It was a third of the entire workforce. Think about that. A whole generation, many of them guys who fought in the war, suddenly had nothing. No job, not enough food, and a burning need to find someone to blame. And if you want to see what that desperation does to politics, just look at these numbers. It's chilling. In 1928, when things were okay, the Nazis were a joke, a fringe party with just over 2% of the vote. Then the crash hits. 2 years later, 18%. And by July 1932, when unemployment was at its absolute worst, they were the biggest political party in Germany. The connection between economic ruin and political extremism is just right there. You can't miss it. So what's the takeaway here? It's pretty simple and pretty scary. When people feel like they have nothing left to lose and the people in charge have no answers, they'll start listening to anyone who promises a way out, no matter how extreme or dangerous that promise might be. And just to pour salt on the wound, what did the government do? They chose austerity. So instead of helping people, they did the opposite. They started making massive cuts. We're talking about money for healthcare, for schools, for housing, all slashed. It just made the suffering so much worse. And it basically pushed even more people towards the extremists who were promising to make it all stop. Okay, now let's jump halfway across the globe to Australia. And Australia's story starts from a totally different place. They saw themselves as the working man's paradise, a land of opportunity, a fair go for everyone. Their democracy was stable, not scarred by war like Germany's. But that whole sunny image, the Great Depression was about to smash it to pieces. Because by 1932, Australia's unemployment rate hit 32%. Let that sink in. 32%. That was one of the worst rates anywhere on the planet. See, Australia's whole economy was built on selling things like wool and wheat to the rest of the world. When nobody was buying anymore, the country's income basically dried up overnight. And sometimes the most heartbreaking things come from kids. This little rhyme that kids were singing at the time, it really says it all. We're on the susso now. It became the defining phrase of their lives. But what exactly was the susso? Well, the susso was this really basic, bare-bones government handout, and it often wasn't even cash. It was food coupons. It wasn't like today's unemployment benefits. You had to prove you were absolutely, completely broke to even qualify. And the system was just overwhelmed. Get this. In New South Wales, the biggest state, almost half of the people with no job got no help at all. So what happens when you lose your home? You end up in a shantytown. They had these places with bitterly ironic names, like Happy Valley in Sydney. And this was just survival. People building shacks out of whatever they could find, scrap metal, old sacks, dirt floors, no water, no electricity. This was what the working man's paradise had become. When people get this desperate, things are going to boil over. And they did. In Perth, back in 1931, thousands of jobless workers marched on the Treasury building. They were just demanding food and shelter. It turned violent, a full-on riot with people fighting the police. The whole country felt like it was coming apart at the seams. But here's the key difference with Germany. People were furious at the government's policies, but they weren't trying to tear down the whole system of democracy itself. So that brings us to a really important question, right? The economic suffering in Australia was, in some ways, just as bad as in Germany. But the political result wasn't the same. Why not? What was different? And we have to talk about something really important here. For one group of people, this wasn't a new crisis. It was just making an awful situation even worse. We're talking about Australia's First Nations people. They weren't even considered citizens, and they were deliberately cut off from even the tiny amount of aid that white Australians could get. For them, there was no safety net, none. Okay, so let's put these two stories side by side. We've got one global disaster, the same starting point, but two completely different endings. So here's the bottom line. In Germany, a country already broken by war, that economic collapse became a weapon. A political movement grabbed it, used the people's misery to tear down democracy, and aimed all that anger outward in a storm of hatred and war. But in Australia, the crash caused incredible pain and riots, for sure, but its democracy, which had deeper and more stable roots, bent, but it didn't break. The suffering didn't lead to fascism. It led to a demand for a better, stronger social safety net once the war was over. And that leaves us with this one huge question, doesn't it? Both countries were staring into the abyss. Both were pushed to their absolute limits. So why did one democracy make it through, while the other was completely swallowed by the darkness? Thinking about that, well, it tells us a lot about how fragile our own world might be.